full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Ghost. Amen. Brethren in Christ, Laudetur Jesus Christus.
In secula.
This is Timothy S. Flanders. This is the meaning of Catholic. I'm joined today by a Catholic writer, Kennedy Hall. Kennedy, how you doing, brother?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing excellent. You know, I was gonna, there's one thing I forgot. I was gonna pull up your little bio. So let's introduce Kennedy Hall. Kennedy is, here's his bio. Kennedy is a Catholic high school teacher, rugby coach, and part-time writer on Catholic topics. He has written for the Colby Center for the Study of Creation, Serviam Ministries, and the Fatima Center, and most recently, Meaning of Catholic. We're going to link his his very first article on Meaning of Catholic. He teaches Catholic religion courses to French immersion students and also speaks Spanish and Italian. Yep. Kennedy has spoken on various youth events as well as on the topic of true Catholic masculinity. He just started a great series on St. Joseph at the Fatima Center, which we'll also link. He has a passion for the traditional Latin Mass and the restoration of traditional piety. A prodigal son, he was brought back into the church with the help of Our Lady of Guadalupe, and prays for the 2 days. And prays for the day that all men depend on the Blessed Mother. He lives with his wife and 4 children in Stratford, Ontario.
Yeah.
So Kennedy, one question I want to cover, because I think I'm going to post this on Friday, which is St. Lucy, maybe on Thursday. Our Lady of
Lucy.
Guadalupe.
Okay, good, cool.
But so can you tell us a little bit about how did Our Lady of Guadalupe bring you back to the church?
Okay, so I was raised kind of nominally Catholic. My mom's an Italian immigrant, so and I lived in Italy for a little bit as a kid, hence the Italian. And so we were very weakly, like sort of a very feeble cultural Catholicism. Anyway, fast forward through life, I had some faith, lost some faith, whatever. That's a whole other podcast. But then came time to apply for teachers college, and I wanted to teach at Catholic schools because I grew up in Catholic schools. As problematic as they were in the theology sense, I had good memories of, football and friendships and all those kinds of things. Anyway, I ended up teaching in a Catholic school board. And in my first couple months there, very providentially, I met a friend of mine. Her name is Katie. And she's actually the godmother with her husband of my second child, Shiloh. And she invited me to go on a mission. I didn't even really know what a mission was, but I knew that I was going to go to Mexico. So I said yes, because it was in February, and in Stratford, it's like -30 in February. So going to Mexico sounded pretty good. I was already teaching in the Catholic school system, and I was going to Mass, and I was like trying to figure out this whole Catholic thing, but I was reading stuff, but I wasn't living in a state of grace. So I wasn't on the right path per se, but I was trying,
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, go to Mexico. It's Mexico City. It's a garbage dump mission, like with Renewal Ministries out of, I think out of Ann Arbor, actually. It's like Ralph Martin. That's his outfit out of there.
I'm familiar.
Yeah, they're very, very Orthodox, and it was very good. So we spent a week there, and then at the end of the week, we went to visit Our Lady of Guadalupe, right? We went there at the beginning of the week. I didn't even know what the image was. I kind of found out what it was while I was there. Anyway, as you can imagine, it was a very like shanty town, poorest of the poor, Mother Teresa sort of situation. And a week of that, and you're just tired and you're vulnerable and all those sorts of things. And I had a massive interior conversion. I figured out who God was, but most importantly, or as importantly, I guess, we went to the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe, and I was there for like 3 hours on my knees. I didn't even know how to pray the rosary properly. I had a plastic rosary, like those little ones you get at like First Communion or whatever. It was in my pocket. I had it for about 1.5 years at that point. I'd never prayed it once. And I got it out of my pocket. I prayed the Our Father on the crucifix. And I prayed the Glory Be on all the Our Father ones. And I prayed the Hail Mary on those ones. I didn't even know what Rosary Mysteries were. And anyway, I did it 2 times through. Like I just was obsessed. And I was just there. And I'm not like a mystic or anything like that, but it was one of those moments in my life where I can truly say that I heard the voice of the Blessed Mother, and it was terrifying and amazing and powerful. And anyway, it brought me home to the Catholic Church, and things have never been the same since.
That's what's up, man. Thanks for sharing.
That's cool.
Praise the Lord. We'll have to get more into that another time.
Yeah.
Today, our topic is the theory of evolution. And I'm really excited for this conversation from Kennedy Hall, because I'm not very scientific myself. I'm more of a historical person. So hopefully Kennedy can help all of us laymen understand the science and all that stuff. So first of all, why is this issue important? Well, the reason it's important is that since it really became prominent in the 19th century, I think it's safe to say more than any other scientific theory has had an impact on the way that we look at the Holy Bible, the way that the world, I think, looks at overall philosophy. It had a very strong influence on the development of eugenics and Nazism, all sorts of stuff.
All the isms.
All the isms.
Yeah.
So, but I think most pointedly, we can talk about our dogmas of the Catholic faith, most especially, I think, of original sin. The idea of original sin is that Adam and Eve were created by God in a state of original justice, and they fell from this original justice into a state of original sin. And then they passed that original sin to all of humanity. And that's one of the fundamental dogmas of the faith, which then our Lord comes to save us from. So
it's like you need it for the salvation. It's a pretty big deal.
So if mankind is evolving from apes, then there's multiple Adams and multiple Eves, and how can they all somehow fall and then pass that to everyone? It doesn't really make any sense. So here's the two textbooks that I have here. So there's Denzinger, and Pius XII says, Humani Generis, 1950, he says, "It is by no means apparent how such an opinion, evolution, can be reconciled with what the sources of revealed truth and the acts of the magisterium of the church teaches about original sin, which proceeds from a sin truly committed by one Adam, and which is transmitted to all by generation, and exists in each one as his own."
That paragraph 4.
Paragraph 4. It's later, and I think it's like 46. Denzinger doesn't have the paragraph numbers. It's no real coincidence that one of the most influential, perhaps the most influential Christian evolutionist, Teilhard de Chardin, denied original sin. And we're living in a crisis in the church largely due to a denial of original sin. I think that's one of the biggest problems. Whereas, on the other hand, Ott, another big hitter, he says, this is page 104, if you're following along at home. He says the idea of the spiritual soul cannot be but created by God immediately. But he says the question of the descent of the human body from the animal kingdom first appeared under the influence of modern theory of evolution. And he says the biblical text does not exclude this theory, he says, although he's very skeptical of it, but he doesn't exclude it. So, Kennedy, what would you say? What is the importance? Why do we need to bother with this scientific theory from the 19th century?
Like, why do we have to bother with it, for or against?
Either way, why is it important that we're having a conversation about it?
Well, I would actually argue that it's an ancient theory. When you really think about the underpinnings of it, it's kind of just pantheism, and it's kind of just Gnosticism. So basically what you have is this idea that from some primordial something or other, the general consensus is it's something like a primordial ooze, which I always find very strange, because people will laugh and say, "Oh, you don't believe in that Garden of Eden, that's a fairy tale." And I'm like, yeah, but you believe we started in soup, like, I mean, it's just, I picture like a can of Campbell's soup. But so there's this idea that we start from, I don't know, some particles, and there is no scientific dogma on this. So, I don't know, particles, soup, ooze, dust, slime, I don't know, literally make it up. So we started from one of those things because no one knows, right? We started from one of those things. And then from there, there's basically this constant like emanation coming out. There's actually in Chardin, one of his work is very creepy. But one of the things he talks about is like the universe is like a flower continuously unfolding on itself. It's a very pantheistic, very sort of Gnostic idea. And it's very similar actually to the ideas when you really look into like the extensive Hinduism and especially Jainism. And you have this idea that there's this constant like going forth and coming back, and going forth and coming back, right? Anyway, that's basically the underpinnings for the philosophical side of evolutionary theory. It was a common thing in Aristotle's time. There was always this idea of sort of the eternal universe that sort of came into existence with the creator at the same time, which is basically pantheism. And then you have moving forward throughout the ages, it sort of got squashed by Christianity, like the Judeo sort of Christian philosophy of a separate God and a separate creation, right? That's sort of different than the pantheistic idea. And then it started coming back around the 1200s, 1100s, which is why the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, one of the major canons that maybe we'll talk about later, but it really condemns this idea that there was, it puts forth this very strong theological dogma that there's like a specific creation starting at a certain time and coming in a very specific order with like special creation of the different forms. And it was to combat sort of a resurgence in like Neoplatonism had sort of come back, which although obviously Plato, there's lots of good stuff in there, you know, like especially, you know, allegory of the cave and things like that. They're pretty interesting meanings, but when you follow Plato's metaphysics, you really get to this sort of pantheistic sort of super virtue. Everything kind of comes forth, starts sounding a lot like Hinduism with Brahman. You know, we're all kind of pieces of this sort of ideal spiritual essence. Anyway, so then it kind of went away after that.
Well, let me just cut in. I want to read that. So this is, you said it was 1215. This is Lateran Council 5, Latin 4, Lateran 4. So it says, God, creator of all visible and invisible things, of the spiritual and the corporeal, who by his own omnipotent power at once from the beginning of time created each creature from nothing, spiritual and corporeal, namely angelic and mundane, and finally the human, constituted as it were alike of the spirit and the body. That's Denzinger 428.
It's pretty clear.
So this is a I haven't looked at this, but is this a like a de fide proposition, let them be anathema? What does the text say of the council?
I don't know if it's anathematized, actually. I'd have to look into it, but it's, I don't know, it's a valid ecumenical council. So, I mean, I don't know if you would say it was an infallible statement, because like you could probably further clarify it or something like that, right? But it's definitely, if you think of like the 6 levels of dogma, it's definitely near the top as far as strength goes.
Yeah. Ott puts God created man out of nothing as a de fide, and then he puts God created, or all of humanity descended from two humans as a sententia certa, which is lever number 4, which you still can't go against. You can't go against sententia certa either. That would be the mortal sin of error against the faith. But it's one level above something you could possibly, with grave cause, question.
And that's the thing too about all these things. Like we live in a very legalistic time where people will, you know, and I see why Ott, for example, was saying it's not excluded in the biblical canon, right? Because like he's being honest. It's not like in the Bible it says like thou shalt not believe in some sort of pre-existing. It doesn't say that. So for him to come out and say specifically as a theologian who has no authority to say anything other than what has been pronounced, he's just being faithful. This is why you'll see in guys like Ott, and even in Pope Pius XII, you'll see these sort of, I want to say very restricted liberties, right? They'll say, sure, this very small area where there's certain speculation, yes, you can kind of work in there. And because these, like Pope Pius XII is a great pope, and William, or is it William Ott, right?
Ludwig.
He's obviously very, he's great. I mean, he wrote the manuals that he wrote. So those guys are like, when it's like they see these things in the brackets of orthodoxy. So they're comfortable with that tiny little freedom. The problem is you have the Chardins of the world, basically every theologian today of the world. You see those guys, they say, well, look, there's freedom here. And then they turn it into this huge speculative theological mess, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
anyway.
Yeah. Okay. So Lateran 4 kind of puts the kibosh on an upsurge of this Platonic paganism, whatever.
Platonism. Yeah.
Is there a consensus by the time we hit the year 1800? Is it pretty, what's the church consensus on these questions at this point?
Well, it was a done deal, right? I mean, like, I haven't been able to find anything where there was, not in the Catholic Church. You have to understand that as well. That's actually something we should touch on. So all of this evolutionary thinking, and actually we should back up. We need to break science down into what are called hard sciences and soft sciences. So hard sciences are things like medicine, like practical medicine, or engineering, or applied physics, things where you can actually like build the thing or see the thing or test the thing, retest the thing, and you know it's going to work, right? Like, you know, you're going to put penicillin with some bacteria in a petri dish, and 1,000 times out of 1,000, it's gonna nullify the sickness or whatever. Same with bridges or surgery, like that type of medicine, right? Then there's the soft sciences, and actually up until about probably just before my son was born, my oldest son, so 4 or 5 years ago, the biology was actually still considered a soft science. I don't know what changed it. It's probably kind of like the APA. I think they just change things when they want because of political pressures and things. But
right.
But very, very little of what we think of as like science is actually a hard science, because the moment you go from the empirical, and I have sat down for hours having debates with these evolutionist types, degrees and this, that, and the other thing, and I'll say to them things like, show me an empirical, like observable, demonstrable, repetitive testing of a certain thing that shows me what you want to show me, and I'll believe you. And I've literally heard these exact words is, well, we don't prove things empirically anymore in sciences. I'm sitting there going like,
oh, really?
Yeah. So what the
heck
are
to me?
Yeah. Because they'll say, no, we infer things. Anyway, at the moment you start inferring things, teasing out meaning, you're no longer doing natural science. You're doing something more like the philosophy of science, or you're doing something like metaphysics. And as a guy who's well-versed in the various theological schools, that if your metaphysics are wrong because your axiomatic first principles are wrong, then the rest of it is going to, it's like a ship off course by a degree, or like one, it might only be a degree, but by the time you get there, you're going to be 1,000 miles away from your destination. And in order to retrace all the way back, you're basically going to have to just restart the journey again. And this evolutionary paradigm, anyway, they're not willing to do that. So, but the church had made it very clear about this not even from a scientific perspective, because the church has always looked at the origins as history. Like, that's what it is. It's not science. It's actually history, because no one was there no one that's writing about it now was there. It's something that happened in the past. It's something that's not seen and can only be testified to by our ancestors. It's history.
That's a very good point right there.
I mean,
it's history, not science per se. When we talk about hard science,
it's not hard science whatsoever. I mean, it's barely a soft science. It's more like, I don't know, alchemy or magic than it is science. Seriously. So
let's get into this. So 19th century rolls around, and what are these first principles that people are developing? Like, I know Darwin was a materialist. I know he didn't believe in the
Yeah.
spiritual world. Like where is this coming from? Bring us to Darwin. How does this all come about?
So, okay. Basically, you could probably go to Descartes. You get this sort of nominalist. I mean, you could probably go to Martin Luther. I don't know. You could go back to the Garden of Eden, to be honest. And you go, you want secret knowledge to be like God. Well, that's basically Gnosticism, which is basically evolution. So, but if we break it down, like think post-Enlightenment, 1600s, early 1700s, we can't underestimate the effect of mortal sin on the intellect. And what we have is we have large swaths of what was Christendom departing from the sacraments. Did the Lutherans even keep confession for a time?
I don't think so. They just had their two sacraments.
So I mean, objectively speaking, the vast majority of folks, or not a lot of folks, were basically falling into mortal sin at some time or another.
Yeah.
Now, if you think about the scientific community, even in those days, it was very radical in its like progression away from the traditional dogmas of the faith. So it tended to be a very libertine culture. There were certain guys that were pretty moral, like Isaac Newton, but a lot of them, you look into their personal lives and they're very messed up. And, you know, even Descartes had a pretty messed up personal life at times. And so you start to see these previously condemned metaphysical theories all of a sudden getting a resurgence, which makes sense because there's no authority to say don't do that. And the intellects are darkened of the vast majority of these scientists. And once they apply these condemned heretical metaphysics, they start trying to play with those in the physical. So you fast forward to a guy named Charles Lyell. Now, Charles Lyell was, I believe, I'm going to say around, it's half a century or so or more before Darwin. My dates, I don't know exactly, but I know he's before Darwin by a little bit of time, to be honest. And he had this idea of what I think are called the geological ages. So basically it was this idea where he looked at like rock walls and rock formations and things like that. And he said, well, how can we figure out how old these things are? Because, you know, the biblical narrative is that the world is, you know, roughly 6,000, 7,000 years old or whatever, right? A little bit of mystery with the dates, but it's not a million or a billion years old, put it that way. It's pretty young. So he had this idea that, you know, if for an example, if you look at tree rings and, you know, you have 1 year for one ring, whatever the rings that go out, he said, well, maybe rocks are basically that way. And this is in the 1700s. This is a long time ago. And he applied sort of these estimates to what he thought were the ages of these layers of rock, because he said, okay, the rocks must have been formed in this way. So imagine, for example, that you have sort of sediment, soot, dust, whatever, that mud that comes in from water coming in and coming out from a shoreline, whatever. Over time, the sun will bake that and you get these hardened layers of sediment. That's where we get this term sedimentary rock.
Okay.
And I'm pretty sure igneous rock actually come from sedimentary rocks. And then the only one that are separate are volcanic rocks, because those come out from the volcanoes, which is totally fine and provable. So he had this idea. Now, there's no real way to test that. Like right off the bat, how do you discern how old a rock is? Because there's no way to test in any repeatable fashion, or even a one-off, you can't ever do it, to see how long it would take for sediment, mud, soot, whatever, to wash in, be baked by the sun for 1,000 years, and then for another layer to come in. Okay, so then he estimated, you know, 100 million years, this many million years is going to be how long it's going to be. I mean, you kind of can just pull these numbers out of a hat. And then from there, that work was not accepted. Like Charles Lyell, it was one of those things that was in the background. It gained a foothold in places where the Masons were pretty big. Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was a Mason, and so was Charles Darwin's father. I haven't been able to find a record of Charles Darwin being a registered Mason, but it's kind of like, you know, is Cardinal so-and-so a Mason, whatever. It doesn't really matter. The thinking in the modern world is Masonic, right?
Right.
It was the same thing. Darwin thought like a Mason. But Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, he had this idea in this book called Zoonomia. And actually, you can read, his grandfather wrote this poem, and it's so creepy. I can't remember it. I saw it yesterday. And it's about creation coming forth from the waves and the seas and coming onto land and all these kinds of things. It's just like evolution. But it started as a poem. It wasn't science. Anyway, he had this idea of zoonomia, and there was various forms of animals, and from those other forms of animals, blah, 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 blah. Total speculation, right? Once again, highly degreed Freemason, and then Darwin's father as well. Charles Darwin, I don't know if he idolized his grandfather, I don't know. Should be noted as well. It's either the father of Charles Darwin or his grandfather. They were very close with Malthus. Do you know Malthus? Or is it Malthus or Malthus?
He's the overpopulation guy, right?
Yes, and he's actually who Scrooge is based off of in Charles Dickens. Seriously. So Charles Dickens is one of those interesting guys, kind of like Mozart, who had like a wretched personal life and like massive affairs and things like that, but did amazing things for sacred music and classical music. Charles Dickens had a really messed up personal life, but his work was extremely Christian. I've heard some people call Christmas Carol like the fifth gospel, kind of one of those writings. Anyway, he was doing a critique on Malthus, on Malthusian economics, because the idea was that it was the survival of the fittest. So the idea was that you should let the poor underclasses just die off and not help them, because it would be better for like the species as a whole, because then the weakest ones would be gone, right? Sounds familiar, right? Survival of the fittest. So that was big in Darwin's family. They were big into politics and statesmanship and all those kinds of things. They were all linked in academia and whatever. Anyway, Darwin, he was kind of an interesting, kind of a troubled guy. And he was in, I think he was technically in seminary because everybody who went to university was in some sort of Church of England seminary type thing anyway. I don't think he ever wanted to be a priest per se. It's kind of like Stalin was in the seminary. And then he wanted to go off and be a scientist, basically. So he ended up taking his journeys, Galapagos Islands, these famous things we hear about. You heard the Finch Beaks thing. He talks about the Finch Beaks. It's one of those famous stories. He sees what he thinks is microevolution, which from Mendelian genetics, Gregory Mendel, the famous Augustinian monk who was a geneticist. Basically what it means is like hereditary characteristics, right, that adapt to certain circumstances. And that's totally legit. You know, for example,
that's observable. You can see that happening. Yeah.
And like here in Canada, for example, in the Northwest Territories, we have like the Inuit population, and they've looked at like their fingers, and because they have to be able to do things with fine motor skills in like -50 Celsius, which, you know, what's getting cold when Celsius and Fahrenheit is the same, and that's around -45. So they have to do things when it's very cold with no gloves on. Well, how do you have fingers that don't freeze? Well, you have much more blood pumped to your fingers, which like the capillaries, the veins in your fingers, they just get thicker. They have thicker tipped fingers. Anyway, that happens within a matter of months and years though. So if you're like a white person who moves up there to work on airplanes or whatever you do up there, the oil rigs, things like that, they'll notice that their fingers actually get thicker and they adapt. So that's basically what you'd call microevolution. And then you go from there, and the guy with the thick fingers marries the lady with the thick fingers, and then their children have thicker fingers. Like that's hereditary things, right?
Right.
So Darwin saw that in animals, the various types of birds. So that, you know, some birds had to get into like longer pine cones or whatever to get the nuts, the seeds that come out, so that over time their beaks grew a little bit longer. Okay, totally legit, totally observable, makes sense because, you know, we see Adam and Eve created, obviously they would have had some sort of skin color, or they would have had some sort of physical characteristics, and from there now we have all these races and things like that. No problem there, right? Now, he goes, essentially, what if we can make the leap from this microevolution, this what we might call adaptation? What if we can make the leap from that to this idea where a thing could actually become another form? So, you know, you have these lizards that are sort of amphibians. I guess those are different things, but you have these sort of aquatic lizard-like things, and they start spending a lot of time on land, and let's say they turn into a mammal. You know, like you just sort of go, okay, maybe that's going to happen. Now, totally theoretical, and Darwin never had any proof for it. And it's funny, you know, his famous book, his two famous books, one is obviously The Origin of the Species, in which he doesn't talk about the origin, except when he talks about God. People don't know that. On the first page of his book, I believe it's first page. It's been a long time since I looked at it. But he talks about like the creator breathing the spirit of life. Anyway, he talks about God creating things. So the actual origin of the species, in the origin of the species, is God. So that's kind of ironic. And then his other book was something called like The Descent of Man. And he just hypothesizes things. Anyway, it immediately gets picked up by all of the dissenters. So all the Masons, all the very sort of loosely affiliated Protestants. A lot of the Protestants held out, of course, and today a lot of the what you would call fundamentalists and evangelicals do hold out, right? Thanks be to God, at least somebody is. And so that's why you see it really started to sweep through countries like Germany and England, because that's where you had these very large Protestant majorities in those countries. Anyway, from there, you just see it. The whole thing about evolutionary theory is that it's sort of begging the question. It's like we assume things are super ancient because of what we think their ages of rocks are. Remember, that hasn't been proven and it can't be. So therefore, we know we have all this time to play with. So then we're just going to say, well, these small adaptations can happen. Give it this magical amount of time that could be 100 million years, or flip a coin, make it up. And therefore, everything is possible. Pretty much the crux of it. There you go. You got an education in evolution worthy of a PhD, which I think with evolution stands for pretty hefty delusion because it's total madness.
Wonderful. Thank you. End of show. So one thing that you pointed out here, and it cannot be overstated, is the pretension of objectivity. Mm-hmm. Even today, we have studies show this, studies show that, studies show this. Yeah. Now the the American Psychological Association or whatever, they've deemed that masculinity is toxic or something. I don't know what they figured out these days, but what you pointed out here was that a lot of these people had sordid lives. Yes. And this question is not like we're going to disagree about this toad is a red toad or a green toad. That has nothing to do with your life. Yeah. This has everything to do with your personal life. Where you get out of this question has everything to do with your life choices, who you marry, if you stay married, do you stay faithful to your wife? All this stuff has to do with evolution. So the scientists cannot possibly be objective about this question. And so it's no coincidence that many, and this goes along all sorts of other disciplines as well that have ramifications. It's not, you can't just talk to an atheist objectively because that atheist he's making a choice that's going to affect his personal life. You know, so it's not, people can't be objective about this. No. And that's because of original sin. People are inclined to evil. Nobody wants God to exist. They want to have their own freedom. So that's such a crucial point because it's so easy, even today, for everybody to hear the greatest, this science or that science. And it's a pretense to objectivity. Because what you see here is, what's interesting is, if you talk to any scientist, and they don't even have to be a Christian, if you just have a scientist who's an honest scientist and wants to question evolution in any way, immediately they are vilified by the scientific community. It is a strong ideology. So anybody who questions evolution, and science allegedly is about questioning things, it's about figuring things out. So if you want to figure something out and question evolution, suddenly you lose your career.
Yeah.
How, that's evidence of a strong ideological bias.
Yeah. Well, you see,
go ahead.
Well, did you see recently there was he's a professor at one of the Ivy Leagues. Anyway, famous computer. He's like what's that field of study called? Yeah, it was in the no, it was computer science. Yeah, but like the math behind it. Anyway, that sort of math, like you are the smartest math geniuses on earth because you're literally the people who are making the codes for supercomputers. Like your brain is better than the supercomputer. So he has a Jewish name, is a secular Jewish guy, and he was in the Claremont Review of Books, which is sort of a pretty respected publication. Have you read it before?
No.
It's generally conservative. Sort of like the National Review is anyway, but it's a little bit more academic, highbrow. Anyway, he is not a Christian. He's sort of just an agnostic-y, secular Jew kind of guy. He's been doing this computer programming stuff for a long time, this computer mathematics. I believe he's at MIT for a long time, basically the best place in the world to be for that stuff. And he's just super well respected. Anyway, he was just looking at the mathematics, the probabilities. And, Chesterton said that, of course, anything is hypothetically possible because it's virtually impossible to prove a universal negative because like, if only, you can just keep going down the rabbit hole until you go crazy, right? Mm-hmm. But this guy was saying like, no. Like in terms of anything that's ever happened ever in life, the chances of this happening mathematically are insane. Like it's statistically zero. Right? It's kind of like maybe you've probably heard this, but they'll say people will try to disprove the need for intelligence in design. No God needed, and they'll say, well, if you put 1 million monkeys in front of 1 million typewriters for 1 million years, have you heard this one?
Not the 1 million typewriters, actually. Please.
So
please
if you put, eventually they'll type Hamlet or something like that.
Okay.
And actually, one mathematician actually took up the challenge. He said it's more like if you have 1 trillion in front of 1 trillion typewriters for 1 trillion years, you'll get something like the first word of Hamlet, from a random thing. Anyway, they tried this study, kind of as a spoof, and they put a few chimpanzees in like one of their habitats with a typewriter. And by like 3 weeks later, there was one letter typed. The typewriter was broken, and they had like defecated on it. So it didn't really work out too well. But even then, it's a stupid idea because the typewriter itself is evidence of great intelligence because it's programmed to do a certain thing and type English words and whatever. So anyway, he came out and he has a little bit of clout, but the stuff that they've been doing to that guy, he's like a really smart, measured guy, not even a fundamentalist Christian, like in the slightest. And he just said, no, this is garbage. So you're exactly right.
Right. So, but for the sake of argument, so we're going to use the method of St. Thomas. And the way that St. Thomas proves anything is that he first thinks of the strongest argument against himself. So if you want to prove evolution wrong, I'm going to first try to prove it right. I'm going to start there. And this is the best I can do. So first of all, what I've got is that evolutionists say that all the different branches of science all coalesce with the evolutionary theory. They all kind of work together. You've got genetics, embryology, all this different stuff. Here's how they prove it. They say, well, first of all, you have to assume that the Earth is billions and billions and billions of years old. Okay. And they use the rocks or whatever. But so what they say is, well, there's these homologous structures. Okay. So what I looked at was there's these whales. Okay. So there's these whales and they have these hind bones, like hind legs. And when you look back in the fossil record, you see there's these other whales that have longer legs. And then you go further back and you find whales that actually have hind legs. So then they posit, well, clearly this is a transition from some kind of land mammal to the whales we have today because, and this is the key point, is that they have these useless appendages now. They don't really seem to...
Vestigial.
Okay. So, and let me finish my case before you respond. So remember my points here. I'm going to go through homologous structures, embryology, DNA, direct evidence, That's all I got. Okay. So they have these homologous structures. They've got these vestigious things, like we've got a few things in our bodies that don't do anything per se. We don't really know what they do. So those are evidence that, you know, if an intelligent design, like, why would he make these useless structures except that they're vestiges of prior ancestors in the evolutionary theory? Yeah. So then they look at embryology, which is the study of embryos. So if you compare all the different creatures at their first stage of development as an embryo, so a human being at 1 week old looks the same as a dolphin 1 week old. There's all the similar structures. There's little nostrils so the dolphin's nostrils move into a blowhole, whereas our nostrils become nostrils. And there's all these similarities in the embryon. You can look it up. There's these photos of all these embryos that are very similar. Okay, so then they say, well, these are all evidence that there's these common ancestors to all these different creatures. Then they look at DNA. They actually look at all the genomes and everything, all the genes, and they say, well, look, we're 92% or 99% ape. We're like 85% sheep, whatever it is. So they look at all the gene structures and they can compare us to all these other creatures. And they say, well, look at how similar we are. We must have come from these ancestors. Mm-hmm. And then they look at that direct evidence that we can observe, which is actually indisputable, like the microbiology. They say, well, look at all these different changes. Clearly there's they morph into an entirely different species. You go from bluebird to redbird. It's totally different. It's a different species. Multiply that by 1 million years, and then you've got a crocodile.
Wonderful. Magic time.
So basically you put it all together, and their strongest evidence is you can find fossils that seem to be transitional fossils. You have birds and dinosaurs that are sort of bird dinosaurs. They're dino birds, and they're kind of the same. We can't really tell what they are. They must be a common ancestor between transitioning from the bird and the dinosaur. Okay. So if there's any evolutionists watching this show, that was my honest best case for your theory based on what I could find on YouTube and my reading over the past few days, not being a scientist. So maybe you have more and you could put them in the comments of all the best ways to prove this theory. That's all I got. So it seems pretty logical to me. What do you think?
Well, I'll tell you what, there was a document that came through the school system here, the school board. I won't go into too many details. I don't think anyone I work with will ever watch this, except for like a buddy of mine who thinks the same way. So anyway, but I was refuting it. And one of my contentions with the document was that they cited Wikipedia a lot. And did you ever watch The Office?
Yeah.
The greatest show of all time. And Michael Scott goes, Wikipedia. The greatest thing at Wikipedia is that anyone from anywhere can write anything they want about any topic. So you know you're getting the best information possible. So I don't even let my students, if my students say they want to cite Wikipedia, I say, no, you can go to the footnotes of Wikipedia and you can show me those. And if that's fine, anyway, so you're not much different than your average master's science student because you used YouTube. And
oh, good.
So you're on good ground there. Okay. It's actually a pretty simple objection. So the idea that there's similarities means there's a common ancestor, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the thing is that doesn't match anything that we've ever seen ever in life. What do I mean by that? Now, maybe within the same species, sure. So like I look like my no-no, God rest his soul, I actually saw a picture of his no-no and they were like spitting image. Fine. Same bloodline, same species, yes. Okay. But if you were to go around and look at the different cars, for example, you see the different types of Toyotas, you wouldn't say they must come from the same common car. It's like, no, they come from the same designer. So if there's any similarities in the various things, sure. Artists tend to make lots of pieces of work that look similar to other pieces of work because they have a similar style. Whatever God's style is, he tends to make things with nostrils. Whatever God's style is, he tends to make things that have 4 legs or 2 legs, right? Whatever God's style is, things in the ocean, if they're going to swim, they tend to have fins, they tend to have tails, they tend to have a dorsal fin, whatever. tend to have gills if they're a cold-blooded fish, and if they're a mammal, they tend to have the blowholes. They can hold their breath for 40 minutes or whatever it is, and they go get air, right? There's actually not that many different types of forms. There's like 22 or something like that of actual animals on Earth. So this idea that because there's similarities in the way they look now means there has to be similarities in the way they looked in the beginning, it's a pretty poor justification, and I think it doesn't really match what we see with anything creative. I mean, at the end of the day, what we're talking about here is we're saying that we're looking at this as Catholics, right? So like we can't take God out of the equation. If atheists want to do that, then they can go, you know, find as many fossils they want in planet Narnia, and they can figure it out for themselves, right? But if we're saying we're Catholics, we have to assume God, right? We have to assume intelligence. We have to assume some sort of design. Even the most hard-lining theistic evolutionists, they're still going to say, well, no, God used evolution here, da, 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 da. Anyway, so you still have to assume design. So I don't think there's much problem with common designer. It's a much stronger argument than common ancestor, because we see that with everything else. Now, as far as the embryos go, there's actually a lot of monkey business that's happened with how embryos have been researched. So for one, all embryos are extremely simple compared to what they will become. So if you're going to have things with like a heart and lungs and, you know, especially mammals, well, when you're at the stage where it's so small that like to the eye, you're only going to see very few things, of course it's going to look very similar. I mean, that'd be like saying, you know, look at the various seeds look at the seeds for like, I don't know, corn versus the seeds for some other thing that's not related to corn at all. I mean, you blow the image up, it's going to look pretty similar. It's going to be like a tiny little thing, and it's going to have some veins going through it. And there you go. You're like, look, they must come from the same common seed. Well, no, not necessarily. They're just really tiny. You can only do so much with tiny things, right? But it's interesting, though. There was a gentleman named Ernst Haeckel. I believe he was German, some German-sounding name. And this just shows you how legitimate evolutionary science is. He made a set of drawings, right? And this was before they even had the ability to blow up the images highly enough. And he drew various sets of what he thought the embryos would look like. So chickens and like rabbits and humans and whatever, fish. Like he just found different ones. And he made them look all very similar. And he was from one of those Germanic places, and lo and behold, it was one of the arguments for eugenics, was basically like, we all are the same and whatever, and you know, it's that kind of thing. So embryology is not really a good argument because, once again, it's so tiny, it can only look so many different ways with so much limited space. And I would say, for one, we shouldn't be doing research on the human embryos. But if we were to pick apart like the different animal ones, when you give them like a matter of 2 or 3 days, they look radically different, right? When you give them a matter of 3 weeks, they're radically different. So yeah, sure, it does, like I said, just like seeds. Do they look really, really similar when they're super, super, super small? Of course. But then when you give them 2 weeks, it's like one all of a sudden has ears and the other one doesn't even have an auditory function. Like it's not even the same species whatsoever, right? Okay. What was the other thing you talked about?
DNA similarities. We have 99% genes of chimps or whatever.
Sure. Great. You know, I think I remember seeing somewhere, it was actually a science fiction movie, and there was a chimp on the plane or on the spaceship. And they said, well, look, we share, I think 97%. And even that's not really true. I don't have the notes on me right now. But it's kind of like when they say 97% of climate scientists agree or something like that. It's not really true. It's like 97% of some surveyed scientists one time in Australia agreed on something, you know? This idea that we're 90, it's not true. It's only in certain areas of the genome. Once again, not an issue. An artist could use the same pigments in different paintings. They're not the same painting, okay? But they have the same pigments, okay? There's only so many materials to go around, right? We obviously share things like breathing and eating and drinking water and having skin and having hair. So, I mean, there's going to be similarities because our environment requires it, right? But whatever the similarities are, they're not actually, in a qualitative sense, 98% like us. Because the smartest thing you'll ever see a chimpanzee do is like use a stick to get honey out of a bee's thing, and then like pick his hair with whatever and throw poop at another one. Like there's no actual, like that's not 98% human.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. If you can take all the things that humans can do, compare that to, yeah, it's not actually a quality. Yeah, I can see that. Let me get in back. Let me go back to the age of the Earth, because I think this is really scientific. Seems to me to be scientifically the backbone of the entire theory of evolution is the age of the Earth. And I was going to ask you about, aren't there more accurate ways than this old way that you mentioned, like carbon dating, half-lives and things like that? Aren't those more accurate? Aren't they based on?
Yes.
I thought, remembering from science class, I thought half-lives and carbon dating was you can take this rock and or this molecule, whatever, and you can measure it for a year and you can see how fast it decays. And then you can look at this rock and you can see what's the half-life, what's the decay rate, and then extrapolate back to look at this age. So isn't that more accurate?
Only for biological things though. So rocks you can't do it with. Now, you can do it with organic material. But even then, the hypothetical life of carbon-based things is like tens of thousands of years. So it's actually a very short half-life relative to like the supposed millions, hundreds of millions, and billions of rocks.
So how did they get this billion years? What's their proof for that?
I don't know. Like I think, like I said, it's back to this idea where there's tree rings, and they know, like we know tree rings go by about the year because you can plant a tree and watch it go from sapling to formidable tree in your front yard in the age of your son being born to moving out to go to college. Like you can see these things happen, right? So that's pretty legit. You can't see the supposed forming of rocks. And you know what's crazy too is, and this is, okay, one of my biggest like red pill moments for evolution, I was never like an avowed evolutionist, but I just sort of accepted it the same way a lot of us do. It's like, well, the church loves science and scientists wear white coats and recommend toothpaste. Therefore, they're very smart. So, you know, like they must know what they're talking about, you know? So I just said, okay, whatever. But all these scientists, well, my biggest red pill was climate change. And I don't care what people think about that, but I remember thinking like a lot of this seems kind of wacky. I mean, how can you measure an entire climate? Like, I mean, you live in Grand Rapids, right? I live in Stratford, Ontario. Like we literally we're like in that Great Lakes basin. I mean, where's the pollution coming from? It gets swirled around in the rain that we share. I mean, there's just so many variables where it's like, how on earth can you can't even, the weathermen can't get next week's forecast accurate, but we're going to try to predict what's going to happen in 50 years. Like it's nuts. So I realized like, okay, then I looked into that and I'm thinking, okay, if one large group of scientists who are so-called experts can be off on certain things, then it must be the case in other things, or at least it's reasonable to assume so. So when I started looking into the ages of rocks, I don't know what they're saying, because the climate scientists are always talking about these massive changes in temperature over the thousands of years, right? Like they'll say, well, there was an ice age, there was a warming period, whatever. And I'm thinking, so you won't even have the same conditions for the rocks, right? Like you won't have, like, okay, it's one thing to say we're gonna put like soot and sediment in a kiln where you're gonna bake some clay, and then we're gonna come out like with a hardened piece, fine, because you put 500 degrees on it for an hour and a half and it was constant. But how on earth is that even reconcilable with the changes in wind and rain and hot and cold? I mean, how on earth do we have rocks in the northern hemisphere, you know, where you've got like icy winters for the last, you know, whatever. I mean, and you've got these massive disruptions in topography because of the plates moving around. I thought, you know, and that's a whole other thing. They never explain where the sediment comes from for the rocks. Like, let's just assume the sedimentary theory is okay. Let's just assume that that's hypothetically possible. And it is hypothetically possible, because everything is hypothetically possible if you want to go down a rabbit hole with Alice. So you have this like soot, this stuff being, washed in with waters of rain or runoff or something. But the thing is like, go to the beach, right? What do you have on the beach? You have sand. But what is sand? Sand is apparently tiny particles of rocks. Like sand doesn't become bigger rocks. It's like the broken up pieces of already broken down rocks. So like, you're basically it's the cart before the horse. You're basically assuming that you're going to have this magical sediment that is plentiful enough to give us enough rock for like rock faces, the Grand Canyon, mountains, whatever. Where on earth did it come from? Like, was there just this sort of amorphous blob of like seriously, you have to think, like, you get your mulch for your yard in the summer, or you get your topsoil. There's like this big dump truck that comes and just plops in the middle of the ocean. I don't know. How did the ocean have a floor? How is there an ocean floor? The ocean floor is rock, I would assume. It's like, none of it makes any sense. You have to assume all these things. It's the same thing with Big Bang cosmology, which is a whole other thing. You're going to have elements that are going to be there, and they're going to compress because of heat and weight. But how can there be weight if there's no gravity? And how can there be, like, it doesn't make any sense. You have to have all the stuff in order to explain away all the stuff. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever, right? It's nuts.
Yeah. I think to me, I mean, when I look at, like you said, just weathermen predicting next week's forecast with accuracy. Okay. Yeah. If we could challenge all the weathermen in the entire world to predict next Tuesday within 10 degrees of each other,
you get like 80%. They get like 50%. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, 50%. I mean, it'd be, ballpark.
I bet like $50.
They're generally, they get a general ballpark, obviously. Yeah. We'll give them credit. But when I think of extrapolating based on the minimum amount of evidence, and when I look at history, what we have in history is a fragment of 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 the amount of stuff that once existed. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to take this little tiny minuscule piece of what was actually in existence, and then we're going to extrapolate all of these calculations based on the little tiny bit of evidence we have on all these different things. It just seems just incredibly insane to think you could have any kind of accuracy. Maybe some ballparks, but it's I like it. My 3-year-old loves planets, and that he watched the he's watching these YouTube shows, National Geographic, of planets. Yeah. And they say, well, then there's such and such planet which is made up of this and this and this, and it does this and this and this, and it revolves this way and does this and it does that. And I'm like, I can't understand how they could possibly know all that stuff with accuracy. Did they take a spaceship and go there and then look at it? No. They looked at a telescope and they looked at all these different things, and they extrapolated based on the little bit they could observe, all these things that they think are accurate. And it doesn't make sense to me how it can possibly, you can see that with accuracy. I sat through, because I did like a sort of my general BA with French and Spanish and whatever. And one of the classes I sat through when I was preparing for teachers college was a science class. Because if you have like a breadth of courses, you can teach more subjects, So I took an Introduction to Astronomy at University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario. And one unit. This is a major university, like one of the best universities in Canada, actually. And anyway, we did a unit on the possibility of aliens. And this was but like, they were like, look, there's this thing called the Enrico Fermi calculation, some Italian guy. And we know that mathematically there has to be aliens. I'm like, oh, have you ever found one? Well, no, but we know they exist. It's like, really? Because you saw one? No, but I'm sure they're there. Like, call me crazy for thinking that there are angels, but you believe in aliens, like, or we've actually seen those angels, in fact.
Yes, we've actually.
It's the difference.
And like, oh my goodness. Anyway,
I guess I think this is a key point, is that we've actually observed miracles. Like, let's talk about science for a second.
Yeah.
Observable facts. Miracles have been observed. You can go to, what is it, Lanciano today. You can see the miracle of Lanciano, the miracle of the Eucharist. You can go to places today and see miracles. They're happening right now.
Yeah.
They're documented. I mean, these things are airtight cases of miracles. Our Lady of Fatima, 10,000 people saw it. All the atheists said that, you know, they wrote it in the atheist newspaper. The sun danced.
Yeah.
Everybody saw it. There's science. Here's some science for you.
Like guys from, like consultants from that had worked with NASA testing the image at Guadalupe, and it's like, oh yeah, there's a heartbeat on the stomach. That's weird. Oh, there's another one because it's for the same one as a baby, and she's pregnant. Like, that's insane. It's a painting. I don't know. You know, like, it's just nutso. You know. Yeah, maybe we should talk about though. I think we've done a good enough job beating up evolution, and as fun as that is, and I'm looking at my notes here. And I think we should really like talk about the nefarious links between like the really evil people and evolution.
Yeah, let's talk. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that part, and then I want to get into what is the magisterium said about Genesis and stuff like that, and then I want to get to some of our patrons' questions as well. So, what are the nefarious? Tell me about that.
All right, let me go through some of these here. Let me go so I don't miss them. So, for one, we know that for one, it's pantheistic, which is anti-creator God, so that's bad. Secondly, we know that the major onslaught of it from Darwin is based in Malthusian economics, which is evil, and we also know it's based in Freemasonic ideals, right? Because one thing about Freemasonic ideals as well is that they've always had this tradition in the Freemasonic like sort of folklore and mythology that things are super, super ancient, so it really fits their idea. Ernst Haeckel, we talked about him. He had those drawings of the various embryos used for eugenics. Okay, it might be folklore. I haven't found the quote, but I've found quotes that allude to this being true from Charles, not Charles Ingalls, that's Little House on the Prairie. The Engels, like Engels, he was Marx's best buddy, Karl Marx. And at Marx's funeral, he's reported to have said that if there was no Charles Darwin, there'd be no Karl Marx. And when you look in their writings, they're huge fans of evolution, because the thing is communism, socialism is basically just social evolution, right? You look at the state as like an organism, and you just sort of like use the good parts and not the bad parts and trim it off, and it becomes this perfect thing, and it goes towards space, this omega point, which is like Terre des Chardin, right? Stalin was and this is true, as a 14-year-old young man, he had in the library in, I believe it was Tbilisi, like the major city in Georgia, the country, not the state. And he read Darwin's Origin of Species. I think he either could read German or they had finally got a Russian translation or something like that. And he read it, and he basically just was convinced God didn't exist. He went and tried to convince his buddies. He went to the seminary and got a bunch of guys to leave with him and become communists because they disproved the Bible using it. Lenin used to sit at his desk, or on his desk, had this famous statue, and you can look it up. It's a chimpanzee contemplating a human skull. So it's the opposite of like that thinker pose, you know, like that one that's like this. Mm. And it's a chimpanzee in like the thinker pose looking at a human skull, because he's looking at this human as he is the master of the human. You know, because I heard a quote once, and it was something like, you know, we're more motivated to prove that we are the legitimate offspring of apes rather than the fallen sons of angels. You know, like, we're so much more enthused about having, you know, crap slinging, you know, like chimps literally go around and they like eat the babies of other tribes, and then like, you know, like they're nuts, and we want those to be our ancestors or share something. It's like, give me a break. Hitler, he had a view of having a pure and evolved race. Pretty simple to understand that. Actually, I think Andrew Jackson, too, the American president, I think he had some influence of that as well. There's always a little bit of Freemasonry and stuff from the American presidents, you know, and probably the Canadian prime ministers as well. I mean, it is what it is. Post-Enlightenment stuff. Okay, when the Chinese, this is true, and there was a bishop, I can find the quote. I have it in one of my notes. When his name was Bishop Bulgara or something like that, some sort of Scottish or Irish name. And when he was in China, before the revolution, the Cultural Revolution there. And revolutionaries are always evolutionists, so that's never good. When he was in China, well, when it was still a monarchy, when he was witnessing all the sweeping changes coming in and like the terrible things with Mao and Zedong and all that stuff, he noticed that the first thing that they would teach the people of the villages when they came in, it was not it was not communist economic theory. See, people think that communism is economics. Economics is a part of communism. Marxist communism is a comprehensive worldview that sees things as sort of like a web of all these various variables. And then if you fine tune them, you get like the perfect society. It's just a form of utopianism, right? But it's materialist utopianism, right? It's not like Thomas More's utopianism, which is actually quite fanciful and whimsical. It sounds awesome, but it's very materialist. It's very evil. So what they would do is they would come in and they would put the village people through a week or more of teachings on evolution, because they knew that if they could prove there was no God, for one, they could get them to worship the state. And secondly, they knew that if they could get the men to think that they were beasts, then they would treat each other as such, and they'd allow themselves to be treated as such. You know, our Lord says that no bad tree can bear good fruit. And I would say, go back even further than that. Like, not even a good seed can bear even a good seed can't even, a bad seed can't even bear a bad tree because it's not going to grow. I mean, like, evolution is rotten at the root, right? Margaret Sanger was a huge fan of evolutionary theory. Margaret Sanger, famous Planned Parenthood fame, you know. And if you look in her writing, she was quite racist. And actually, the gas chambers that Hitler used, they were developed in part by a professor in California who wanted to exterminate people with Down syndrome.
Yeah, the connection between American eugenics and Nazism is very underreported, unfortunately.
Yeah, and
but
if
it's
you
there.
Look, yeah, and actually, President Kennedy, who I'm named after, my dad. Anyway, we didn't know as much about them when I was named after him. My dad liked him as a kid. To my dad, he was just the president who made the black people and the white people go to school together, so we thought he was cool, you know, and that whole thing. My dad's like that age, right? Born 1951. When he came back from visiting Germany as a university student, he praised Hitler in his writings. He said, "Oh, he's amazing," right? Pretty crazy stuff. Sanger, she believed that she was working in accord with this universal law of evolution. That's her own quotes. She maintained that the brains of Australian Aborigines were only one step more evolved than chimpanzees and just under blacks, Jews, and Italians. So as a guy with an Italian mother, I have Italian citizenship. I'm very triggered by that. When arguing for eugenics, Sanger quoted Darwin as an authority when discussing what she called natural checks on population, such as war, which helped to reduce the population. Her magazine even argued for state-sponsored sterilization programs, forcibly steering the less capable, etc. So, I mean, I don't know, we could go on and on, but the fruits, the comrades of evolutionary theory are, well, Che Guevara of Cuban fame was a big evolutionary theorist. So was Fidel Castro.
Yeah, I think if you just take evolution as truth for a second, it creates a world that nobody wants to live in except for the elites who have power, of course. Mm-hmm. No one wants to live in a world where everybody just competes to the death and you just kill each other and take what, amen. The entire fabric of every society is based on something opposite than that, which is laws, natural law, things like that. Spiritual realities. Every single society, this is one of the biggest counter arguments to me is that evolution, really every single society is set up and founded on an idea that's opposite than that.
Every family is, right? I mean, you have a child and they're helpless. There's no survival of the fittest. It's insane. Every baby would, like, why would, it's like we're not even made that way. It's nuts.
So, yeah, I mean, but there is, we're living in the culture of death. We're now in the reign of the Masons. The children are being sacrificed to Moloch. And so we're living in this evolutionary world. Everything is based on evolution because people want to satisfy their lusts and sacrifice their children to Moloch. So that's the world we're living in now. It's based fully on the evolutionary idea.
Yeah.
Even people don't realize it, I think. But it's just sort of an assumption that pervades everything. It's a very foundational concept that has
it's a mythology, right? Like you'll be talking to a friend about football or something, and it's like, oh, so and so, his background, he's like Jamaican. And they'll be like, oh, well, where his ancestors are from in Africa through evolution. But I'm like, what? We're just talking about football. Like, what are you even saying right now? Or well, it's the caveman in me. It's like, it's the caveman in you. There's not even that many caves, by the way, right? Go find a lot of caves. Like, there's not that many caves out there. So I don't know where all these cavemen lived, right? And also, like, anyway, it's so dumb. It's so dumb. And the theory of the history of the fraud, like, the fraud in evolutionary theory is nuts. Like, I'm just looking at my notes here. I forgot. There was Piltdown Man who was from Piltdown, England. And like, they took a piece of a jawbone from a chimpanzee, and they made a mold out of the rest and like dyed it to look, it was the same age, and called it a skull of and then that was taken as just a fraud. It was like Universal Studios using props and then calling it a fossil. Nebraska Man, you ever heard that one?
No.
1924, I believe. They found a tooth. One tooth. Within a days or weeks, it was in the New York Times. You can look it up. Within days or weeks, in the New York Times. Full drawings of upright, caveman-looking things with skin color. It was black and white, so they were black because it was the newspaper. Hairstyles, little like loincloths. And like, it was heralded by, so-and-so from Harvard and so-and-so from Yale. It's like, then they found out that it was actually the tooth from a pig. But the point is, it was a tooth. You can't reconstruct an entire, anyway, that's like, hey, Lucy, you hear of Lucy?
Yeah, I've heard of Lucy.
Okay, so Lucy, oh my goodness, found by two South African guys with very Dutch names, right, in the Afrikaners sense. The Beatles, actually, they're Lucy in the Sky with, no, Lucy the Fossil is named after Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, a song.
Oh, okay.
Which was a song that was done on acid trips while working with, meditating on Aleister Crowley stuff. So anyway, that's another crazy. It's just like the links to like demonic things are nuts. So Lucy, they found this, like, looks like an ape. Anyway, these researchers decided that over time, right, because they knew this because they were scientists, they obviously knew everything. They decided that she wasn't actually meant to walk on all fours like her hip bones were showing, but because of the fossilization process, her true posture was distorted.
Oh.
Actually, and you can see this on video. They drilled through, because it's the 70s. They drilled through this fossil to change the alignment of her hips to show that she was actually meant to walk upright. That's nuts. That's nuts. And then, like, she's probably just some sort of a even crazier link. You ever heard of Peking Man? Not Peking like Peking Tom or whatever.
Yeah,
in China. Guess who was on that dig?
Oh, that was our buddy Teilhard, right?
That was Teilhard de Chardin.
All right.
Catholic priest.
There he is.
Anyway, and that was directly within the, it was in China in the 1920s and 30s. And that was, it was a big link between China and Russia. So figure that out. Anyway, it's just like, and then the thing is, obviously, do the real like credible scientists disregard these frauds? Sure. But you have a snake oil salesman industry, and then for some of them you got caught. But like so you say, well, we don't actually associate with those ones. No, like it's all snake oil salesmen, and the whole industry is corrupt. Anyway.
Yeah, and this goes back to the fact that why are we so enthusiastic about this is because we want to act like apes. We want to act like animals. We want to just fulfill lusts and dominate people. That's what we really want to do. It's like we don't want to live in an evolutionary world, but for everybody else. But for me, I do want to live in an evolutionary world. And so that's really at the heart of it. And that's latent in everybody's original sin. So I want to get to, let's try to wrap it up. Magisterium? But I want to, the magisterium. So the magisterium, 1907, Leo XIII sets up the Pontifical Biblical Commission. And there's a number of authoritative statements. Now, Pius X said that the answers of the Pontifical Biblical Commission must be assented to by the faithful under pain of grave sin.
Yeah, mortal sin.
And so these answers are really a very high magisterial authority. There's really never been a coherent, just like we're in this conciliar crisis by propping up a pastoral council, which is a nebulous concept in the first place. No one knows what a pastoral council is or what authority it has, but everybody knows it's the highest authority. And so, but we have a very specific, we've got a saint pontiff says the PBC, we must obey their decisions under pain of grave sin. There's been no other magisterial act since that time that has revised in some way the authority of these decisions. So I believe it's 1907, but they rule on Genesis 1-3. And what they say is, I'm paraphrasing, but what they say is that Genesis 1-3 records actual history. These are things that actually happened. Okay. And it says that we must hold to the obvious literal sense unless there is some reasonable way to see it some other way. They do say that the term day is not entirely clear in the tradition. It can be either be a 24-hour day or possibly just a span of time. But they're not, so they're not saying specifically every single facet and every single detail of how this all happened. Exactly. But they are saying that this is all history. This all happened as its plain meaning is, unless there's some obviously not literal sense coming out of it. I think that there's some arguments to be made in terms of like God makes the light on day 1, but he makes the sun on day 4. So is that like not, it's there. I mean, to be fair, the whole 1-3, Genesis 1-3 is written in a very mystical way. It's not like the book of Samuel, then David got up and slew Goliath. It's a different sort of literary. So the Pontifical Biblical Commission says it is history. That actually happened. But they don't go into very scrutinous detail. So have I summarized it?
Yeah, but I would add a couple things. So like back in the day when the church put out really wonderfully concise theology, okay, where you could actually make sense of it, there was always order. So I believe there's 8 questions. Is there 8 or 9?
I don't know.
I think it's 8.
Right here.
I believe it's 8.
Yeah.
And the questions go in sequence, and the sequence is not an accident. So by the time you get to the place where they're saying you can look at the word day as being either 24-hour period or not, I think it's number 7 or 8. And the significance of that is that it's like they answer all of these qualifying statements, And then after you've considered all those qualifying statements, within that framework, you can then look at the word day. The reason is, I believe it's question 4 or 5, is they basically say, are we allowed to hold to the opinions of the church fathers? And like it says something like, can we hold to the pious opinions of the church fathers? And they say, of course you can. Now, all of the church fathers, except for Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and St. Augustine, every single one believed in 6 literal days. Clement of Alexandria, Augustine, and Origen, they had, because they were general, well, Origen was working with some of the Hebrew stuff, but they took this idea that, like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. They said, okay, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That means that it was done like that. So they took the days as being sort of metaphorical, meaning like these were the days of revelation. So there was an order to how creation was revealed to the angels and things like that. And Augustine would talk about what he called these, I think, ratio seminalis, like these rational seeds sort of thing. Not like evolutionary thing, but like the form goes out and then from there it grows, right? So it's like fully there. It's almost like embryos or something like that rather than, you know. So he had that. And St. Thomas Aquinas held to the Augustinian view for the most of his younger part of his life. And then by the end of his life, he had held to the 6-day literalist view for the most part. So yes, can we look at the word day as metaphorical in the context of the Pontifical Biblical Commission? Yeah, if we take into context the order it's given us and hold to the pious opinions of the church fathers, which are 6 days or instantaneous, timeless, sort of metaphorical days, because creation happens like that. And St. Augustine was working with the Vetus Itala versions of the scriptures, like the before the Vulgate, and in there the word simul is used to talk about, and there's a couple ways to interpret that word, and the word simul basically means simultaneously. That's where we get the word simultaneously in Latin, right? So he says, well, okay, everything's created at once. It's a pretty, I actually tend to sympathize with Augustine's view. I just love Augustine so much that it's a very reasonable one. Now, do you have this text on you there?
Well, yeah. It was question 8. There are 8 questions. Question 8 is the one, because so it seems it's, when you read through this, it's basically question 8, I think, is really the only one that gives any space, like you were talking about, like kind of a space where we could get a little freedom on that. One of the questions from one of our patrons was, is it a mortal sin to be old Earth?
Well, no, I'm not going to say that it's a mortal sin, because like I'm not going to put that on somebody. Like, who am I to say that? But I would say this. Do you know Father Isaac Mary Relier?
Fatima Sutter?
Yeah.
Brooklyn guy? Yeah. Franciscan? Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, funny story. One of the guys I go to mass with, he went on like a month-long discerning thing with Father Isaac back when he was discerning to become a priest or not. Anyway, he's got like 7 kids now, so he didn't become a priest. Anyway, so Father Isaac, in one of the question periods at one of his conferences, it was a youth conference, and one of the kids asked, do you have to pray the rosary every day to be saved? And he said, like, isn't confession enough, the sacraments, whatever. Father Isaac kind of goes, sure, you don't have to pray the rosary, technically speaking, but your Blessed Mother has come down a dozen times, and the last 6 of them, she said, pray the rosary every day. And it's very to the point. I won't do the accent because I'll make fool of myself. But in the Father Isaac way, is like, so if you don't pray the rosary every day, you're stupid. Like, he just like, and he says, listen, it's we're so legalistic. You can make a mortal sin against prudence, right? Like, you can sin against the cardinal virtues. So it's like, if you're holding on to something for which there's no proof or good proof, and it's not keeping with the sense of Scripture, because we even talked about, like, why are the days, that the years of Adam's life and descendants, so, like, everything is so specific. Like, you really got to stretch that out. So I would just say it's probably imprudent. I'm not saying it's a mortal sin, but I am saying that it's probably linked to an attachment to a worldly theory, and that can't really bear any good fruit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like he also asked, who was quoting Providentissimos Deus, and it says, "We are not to depart from the literal and obvious sense, except only where reason makes it untenable or necessity requires." And then he asks, "What is the literal and obvious sense of the 6-day creation?" Well, it's 6-day creation.
Yeah, like that's the key. I mean, and like, I don't know who this guy is, but this is a good question. Like, my students ask me this stuff all the time. Like, I remember one time hearing a quote, and the guy said, "Well, science just wants." He was talking about Big Bang cosmology, which is so nuts and stupid. He was saying, the quote was, "Scientists just ask you to believe in one miracle, and they can explain everything else." You know, it's like, you believe in God, you believe Jesus Christ rose from the dead, you believe the Red Sea was parted, you believe fire from the sky, you believe Sodom and Gomorrah is blasted out, you believe in like pillar of salt for Lot's wife. I mean, you believe all these things, but what are those realistic miracles? You know, like, do we only believe in realistic miracles? I mean, 6 days. I mean, if Jesus Christ can say rise and he changes the created order and brings a dead man to life, why can't God, the creator of all things, say, you know, be light made, and it is made? I mean, it's the same thing. It's the same thing.
So this is kind of a general question, but what about dinosaurs? All these big creatures, obviously they dated them to be millions of years ago. Also talk about these discoveries of organic matter as well.
Okay.
Tell me
in
about
the dinosaur bones. Okay, so first of all, are you familiar with where the vast majority of dinosaur bones are found?
Aren't there a lot in North America?
Yeah, vast majority.
Okay,
and
so
some in Saudi Arabia and parts of Africa. Anyway, parts where no one lives in any of the early biblical time.
Okay.
I mean, I've never seen an elephant in my backyard. There's African lion safari in Guelph, Ontario, which is an hour down the road. It's fun.
Don't you guys have mammoths in Canada?
Yeah, we still do. They actually play hockey. But I'm just saying, like, you know, massive predators halfway around the world, there could have been a million of them and you never saw them. Like, it doesn't matter. They're not going to get on a boat and come over. Also, too, like, if you follow the biblical timeline, the population would have been like maybe a few thousand people by the flood. So even if there was a world, I mean, that's just, you could avoid them. I mean, it's not that much different than, you know, if the world is actually a better place physically, which it would have been because it would have been closer to the perfection of the creation, there would have been plentiful food and all these kinds of things and whatever. Like, it's just, you can speculate, but it's not that hard to see how you could coexist. Also, though, what's interesting is every single culture has dragon mythology. What's that about? Like,
yeah, right. That's I think one of the, and that kind of gets into one point was every single culture has this memory of these dragons or creation or all these different things. And in order to believe in evolution, you basically have to say everybody who ever believed all these different stories across the entire history, they're all morons.
Yeah,
and I know. I'm the smartest.
You're the smartest, yeah, because you're further from the source and you know about detective work.
Yeah, exactly.
The better you get at knowing the truth.
So what about this organic matter that they've found from time to time? So
yeah.
So that means that the fossils are not billions of years old. Is that
well,
what
okay.
That means?
Yeah, so it's a lady named Mary Schweitzer. She's the most famous one. She's at some Midwestern university. Is where you live, does it count as a Midwest?
Yeah, I'm Midwest.
Okay, so do you know that guy on YouTube, You Betcha?
You Betcha. Is that like a Minnesota thing? We don't talk that way.
No, I know, but it's all about Midwestern stereotypes. Anyway,
okay. I haven't seen that. I probably enjoy that. Yeah,
it's really good. I realize one of the reasons why I love people from the Midwest is because it's basically Canada. So, you know, or maybe Canada's based in the Midwest. You know, do you say pop or soda?
Pop.
That's the way you say it, right there. Okay, so. Anyway, so Mary Schweitzer, she's at, I believe it's somewhere in like Montana, because there's this place called Death Valley in Montana.
Yeah.
It's Death Valley. Another thing to think about though too, sorry, just a side note. Name one species. You can't. This is a rhetorical thing. You can't name one species where all of the members of that species go to a hole to lay down and die. Like, why on earth would we find congregations, massive graveyards, essentially, of thousands of the same animal? It would only happen, and it's always in valleys, which are low points, and it would only happen if there was something that caused pressure on all of the members of a species that they had to be pushed down to the lowest point where they all died. Which
like
could only
flood.
Sounds like a flood. Sounds like a flood. Come on, man. It's almost like the Bible's true. So Mary Schweitzer finds a T-Rex bone. I think it was a T-Rex. I'm pretty sure it was T-Rex. Anyway, they've got tons of these. Like, it's not like one of the rare ones. So where she was working is they had to go in and out by chopper to get any major equipment out. They couldn't bring vehicles in because it was so undulated, the terrain and things like that. So they couldn't get the bone onto the chopper without slicing in half, which is, they did it with their materials and their implements and did it fine. And because she wasn't working to put things in like museums, she was working to like test stuff, you know, so specimens and things. So anyway, she grew up a fundamentalist Christian. She discovered paleontology, became an atheist. She was I would honestly say, being like as nice as I can to her, I've never met her, but like, she seems like an honest woman, like believed the Bible, thought the Bible was disproved, followed the evidence, found evidence, questioned what she thought. She just seems like someone who's like, I'll just kind of follow the trail, which is admirable, at least in an intellectual sense, right? So she gets this stuff back to the lab. They discover in it that there are organic material inside, which is impossible because organic material, carbon-based stuff, can't last for more than maximum, hypothetically speaking, in perfect conditions, I don't know, 60 to 100,000 years. It's like nothing compared to the age of a dinosaur bone, theoretically, right? Anyway, they test it. They find basically there's blood cells in it. And the carbon dating on those goes back to about 5,000 years, 6,000 years, biblical timeline. Anyway, she was looking at this research, and this is in a magazine, this is in Smithsonian magazine, and there's a bunch of write-ups, but this one big write-up on her was, I believe, in the Smithsonian magazine. It's free online. It's a pain and it's terrible to read because these scientific journalists, I don't know, they write as poorly as evolutionists do. There's no logic to it, so it's hard to follow, but you can read it. And she finds that it's whatever. She's standing beside her mentor, and her mentor says to her, "Prove this wrong." Because, and that's a scientific approach. This doesn't match everything. I know you did your experiment right, but you got to prove this wrong. She spends the next 10 years of her life. It was discovered in 2006, I believe. And I believe that she sort of wrapped up her obsession with it by about 2016. And she tries to disprove it. She can't. She's got lots of pressure from all the people in her field, as you can imagine, because this ruins all the Jurassic Park dreams, right? So the only thing she does in the end is she basically realizes she does this in keeping with how airtight all the science is. She devises some sort of study taking into account the environmental elements of the water and soil deposits in the area, and shows how iron deposits in soil could somehow corrupt the aging of carbon-based life forms in their test. Problem is, fine, let's just say she's off on the dating of the carbon. The carbon still can't, the carbon can't be older than like 60 to 100,000 years, which is still like a blink of an eye compared to, 80 million or whatever. So it's like, it's still a big problem.
Now, why if we doubt the billions of years, why would we accept that it can't be more than 5,000 years old? Why do we think that's accurate?
You're exactly right. So that to me, it's like that just shows further incompetence in the field, because then there was another, and this is in the same magazine article from the Smithsonian, I believe. And another scientist somewhere had said, "Oh no, we've been able to find carbon that goes back like 80 million years or something like that." And it's like, then all of your calculations on how half-life stuff works that you've been teaching, like all of it's wrong. So no matter what you do, This is the thing about evolutionary science. It's constant moving the goalposts. It's like, we believe all these things because we're sure of this until we encounter some major objection. And it's like, no, it's actually this. It's like, oh, no. So it's like, I don't know, why would it, is the analogy like, if I had an accountant and he lost $1,000, like I would fire him. If you lose 80 million years, like, you are such an incompetent moron. I don't know why you're like, what are you doing?
So you're saying, I get that. So you're saying if you apply the half-life to this rock, you get 80 billion years. But if you apply the same exact principle to this carbon, then you get 5,000 years.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
something's wrong.
Something's off no matter what you're doing. Right.
So, and there's one more thing I want to point out that I've been looking into, and that's Michael Behe. And he argues he's one of the lone critics of science, critics of Darwinism, and he argues that basically when you look at on the molecular level, you look at DNA, because the whole theory of evolution is that there's these mutations and that they eventually create a new species. But he points out that we look at the molecular level, all the mutations always break down what you have. They take what you have and they take one thing away, or they take one thing over here and put it together with this, or they're just taking what you have and they're changing what you already have. They're never getting something new out of it. And one of the greatest experiments is with bacteria, which multiplies and replicates 1 million times. I mean, it's the fastest multiplying thing. So you should be able to see this happening. But what you see in the molecular level is the opposite of evolution. You don't see more complexity, you see less complexity. And that's the way that it happens on the molecular level, which completely contradicts the entire theory of evolution right there. So I think that's a really good point here. And he's basically just been vilified and not really proven wrong.
He works with the Discovery Institute.
Yeah.
They're intelligent design theorists. They do a really good job of breaking down why evolution is silly. But for some reason, they still accept the ancient age stuff. I don't know. But anyway, so they're very good, but they're not necessarily, they do some good stuff, but you got to be careful with some of what they do. Yeah, there's this thing called thermodynamics, right? And there's a second law of thermodynamics. And basically it means like all things are going to go through this state of decay, right? And there's this thing called genetic entropy, which is a principle that we see where it literally means like your genes are getting worse over time. We think we're getting like better because we're living longer. We just have better medicine and better comforts, but we're actually we're weaker than our ancestors as far as our actual constitution goes. There's also neurological entropy. So like we're literally getting dumber than our ancestors. Like we're scientifically stupider than they were. And then, all of the evidence points to like a destabilization of the universe. So things are destabilizing, yet somehow they're getting more complex and refined. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, the observable evidence indicates that there's been a fall of man. There's been a fallen universe that's being decayed. That's what the observable evidence looks like. So let's wrap this up. Before we do, where can people go to learn more about this subject, Kennedy?
Okay, so I'm going to say everybody, and I'm going to make sure I always forget if it's .org or .com. Okay.
We'll get and put it in the show notes.
Kolbe Center, like Maximilian Kolbe, because Maximilian Kolbe despised evolution, and he was trained as a chemist, and he was living under the Nazis, right? And he, one thing that we should add, he was a huge devotee of our Blessed Mother, right? He'll be a doctor of Mary one day. That's actually something Isaac Mary Relier talks about, Father Isaac. Did a recent talk in Poland on that. It's really good. Anyway, he was looking at the Immaculate Conception, and Our Lady said to Bernadette of Lourdes, she said, "I am the Immaculate Conception." Now, obviously, we can add the emphasis on the word "the," and maybe we're just sort of adding our own emphasis on the wrong syllable, as they say, right? But I am the Immaculate Conception. I mean, if Mary is uniquely immaculately conceived, then that means Adam and Eve can't be conceived. And if you're going to follow the evolutionary paradigm in some fashion, I mean, Adam was conceived in the womb of some sort of ape thing, and I don't know, it just gets pretty ugly pretty quick. And, you know, we haven't even talked about, and maybe we'll do another show on this or something, but the attributes of God. I mean, does this sound like God? Like he uses death, disease, and destruction to bring forth who's supposed to be the exemplar of Jesus Christ. You know, it's like, that's just gross. Like, I don't know. I just think it's blasphemous, to be honest.
Yeah, I think one of the things we were talking about this on Twitter, but I forgot to mention it, was that the way that the New Testament takes Genesis literally.
Yeah.
And our Lord says, in the beginning, he made them male and female. St. Paul says Adam was formed first, then Eve.
Yes.
And that St. Peter talks about the flood. I mean, the New Testament is taking this literally. And if you believe in the inerrancy of the scriptures, it's hard to take Genesis in sort of some mystical, allegorical, evolutionary sense when the New Testament writers and our Lord himself indicate a literal Adam and Eve.
Yeah, it just shows how like myopic we are today. You know, like there's 4 senses of scriptures. It's possible that Genesis, because it's the word of God, it's possible that it's multi-layered, right? I mean, that would only make sense. I mean, like, I don't know if there's this poem, I don't know if you know it, it's called In Flanders Fields. I think it's a Canadian thing. It's a World War I thing.
Oh yeah, I know.
Yeah. So in Flanders Fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row and row. Anyway, the point is though, is like, it's a poem, but it's historical, because it's like an actual place, an actual event, a war that happened with, and he talks about the things. It's poetic, it's moral, so it's like tropological, as we'd say, and it's allegorical at some points, because he talks about, you know, passing the torch, which is, you know, whatever. It's 4 layers, and it's true. It's true on 4 different layers. It's totally possible that Genesis is true objectively. It's true analogically, anagogically. It's true morally, and it's true in a poetic. Of course it's true. It's God. Of course he's going to make things true and beautiful on every different layer, because why would we expect anything less from his story, you know? Anyway, people can go to the colbycenter.org. You're going to do show notes for this?
Yeah, we'll put all these links below.
So maybe I haven't talked about this, but I won't, because we have to get going. But one of the articles you should read was written by me. After you read all, like, if you just look up like the resources on the site, there's just all these really great rock solid, just kind of like, I want to know the nuts and bolts of this. There's tons of that there. But I wrote an article called Exposed. Evolution Exposed, the missing link between evolution and effeminacy. So I actually think evolution makes men into soft, weak men, and there's reasons for that. Which makes sense with how soft and weak all our men are today. Anyway, so that's one you can read. Go to the Fatima Center, and I have a series of articles on the Bible, but a couple of those deal with how to interpret Genesis. Look up Sensus Fidelium, and there's lots of sermons on there. If you just look in like Sensus Fidelium Evolution, you'll find tons of really good sermons. Father Ripperger, famous Father Ripperger from internet fame, The Exorcist, he does a really good job talking about how stupid evolution is. And then the guy who runs the Colby Center is a gentleman named Hugh Owen. And actually, on the feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe, there is 2 free episodes of their finally to be released DVD series called Foundations Restored. So foundationsrestored.com. They've been working on this for a long time, and I was talking to the guy who runs Sensus Fidelium, who's a big proponent of this traditional creation stuff, and he's friends with Hugh Owen, who runs the Colby Center. And he was like, the demonic activity that, like, just crazy things, like equipment, like the best equipment with like 4 backups, losing the files over and over, like just crazy stuff. The devil does not want this to be known. And I can personally attest, when I started going down this wonderful rabbit hole of traditional creation, I've been visited by the devil a few times in my life. And there was one time I was on my driveway, and it was like, it was clear. It was like, I don't want you to know this. You know, it was just, anyway. So really good stuff out there. We'll put in the show notes, but there's tons of great stuff.
Sweet. Thank you. Yeah, we'll put all that in there. So be sure to like, subscribe to the channel. Yes. Give us all your comments, all your objections, everything you want. Put it in the comments. We'll talk about it. We'll discuss it. We'll do more shows. You can get my book by becoming a patron of the Meaning of Catholic. And some of this we go through. It's called An Introduction to the Holy Bible for Traditional Catholics, and it goes over the history of the biblical studies and interpretations and how this evolution also played into that. And it goes into Mosaic authorship and all sorts of things. So take a look at that. We'll have all the links below. So thanks for watching. If you watched, I think we're approaching 2 hours at this point. So thanks if you watched this far. So we're going to close in prayer. We're going to pray the Our Father. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost.